Professor Lumumba, there is a great deal of ignorance in the northern hemisphere when it comes to the African continent, especially in Germany, where I come from. Through my journalism, I try to challenge and counteract that ignorance. The average citizen does not understand the political interconnections, and they are disconnected from their own history. Politics, media, and the educational system are not inclined to paint the right picture of the African continent. So that's why I'm here in Kenya, Nairobi, to talk to you, because I believe there is hardly any other unifying voice that can fill our knowledge gaps the way you do. My first question is, are Africans victims?
There is a sense in which Africans have been victims, and this victimhood must be understood in a historical context, in the context of slavery, in the context of colonization, and in the context of neo-colonization. There is a beautiful book that has been written by a Nigerian called Adekeye Adebajo, titled The Curse of Berlin, Africa After the Cold War, in which, of course, he traces contemporary African problems to the partition of Africa amongst the European powers in 1884 to 1885 in Berlin, Germany. And therefore, when one uses that history, one can legitimately say, without fear of contradiction, that Africans have been victimized. First of all, as I've said, through slavery, the African person, himself or herself, was commodified and taken to different parts of the world, across the Atlantic. And we also sometimes forget that earlier than that, in the Arab world, the Indian Ocean slavery is seldom talked about, but I think there were many more who were taken to that part of the world. And of course, after slavery, then Africa was divided into spheres of influence for her natural resources. If you look at the Congo, the Free Congo state, which was the personal property of Leopold of the Belgians, which actually sparked off the conference in Berlin, you could see that the reason why Africa was victimized was because of our natural resources. But that said and done, I think it is improper for Africa to continue to wallow in this state of victimhood, because it is not only the continent of Africa that bore the brunt of slavery or that was colonized. There are other parts of the world that were colonized, but have since gotten out of this lamentation and are moving apace. Africa is also moving apace outside of that sphere of victimhood, but in my view, at a very slow pace. In slow space and pace, as it were.
You know, if you tell the people in Germany that we had colonization, we had slavery, and we have neo-colonial power structures, they discredit it as being a leftist idea.
First of all, this kind of language, left or right. What is leftist? What is right? What is centrist? These are terminologies that only make sense in Europe because of its long history, and specifically in Germany post the World War II. They can talk about leftist and talk about rightist and talk about centrist. But in this part of the world, I'm one who is slow to talk about those things as being leftist or rightist, or the isms, capitalism, communism, and all these isms. I would tell them to run away from being victims of that kind of labeling and ask the real question. Were African countries colonized? Fact. Are they still victims of neo-colonization through European and American institutions? Fact. The IMF is still alive and well. The World Bank is still alive and well. The WTO is alive and well. And if you look at the European powers, even at individual level and through the European Union, they still try to dabble in African politics in different ways. Look at the British through the Commonwealth, supposedly of independent sovereign states, but which is headquartered in London with the British monarch as the permanent head. Look at La Francophonie, which is headquartered in Paris and puts together countries which were former colonies of France. Look at the Community of Portuguese-speaking states, which is headquartered once again in Lisbon. And look at how they still want to control the activities in their former colonies. So we are talking about factual issues. We are not moralizing nor philosophizing, because there is evidence and our assertions are evidence-based. If you look at Germany, for example, she uses institutions such as the GIZ to continue to perpetuate soft power and to have footprints in many countries, including Africa. So I would liberate such individuals from their assertions and tell them we are talking about factual issues which can be verified on the ground.
So you talk about the GIZ. Can you explain to me how it is working, or our viewers, so that understand?
If you look at your typical European country, what they do is to create non-governmental organizations or governmental organizations in which the government does not operate directly, but which are funded by government. And what do? They enter into agreements with countries, African countries or African institutions, and they say, we are supporting you. And they support them to hold meetings. They support them in the health sector. They support them in agriculture sector. They support them by bringing in experts to do certain things. And history has demonstrated times without number that it is still true that he or she who pays the piper calls the tune. So what do? They influence processes. They take you for courses in German university or German institutions or the Goethe Institute. And these are activities that are designed to indoctrinate African intelligentsia. And it is true that if you control their mind, you control them. And that is what institutions such as GIZ do. And it's not only GIZ. We are seeing right now, the Americans are telling us what USAID was doing over the years. We did not know. They were involved in every sector. And one of the Americans, as I said, that these were actually spy agencies. You would say that about UK Aid. You will say that about Danida, SIDA. There is no shortage of them. They may look humble and harmless on the face of it, but the truth is that these are subterranean maneuvers which are designed to continue to control the African continent, which unfortunately is divided. Whenever we talk about Africa, we also have the tendency to describe Africa as if we are talking about a country. No, Africa is a continent with 54 sovereign countries recognized by the UN and other claimants of statehood which are not recognized, like Sahrawi or Somaliland and Ambazonia, and they operate differently, culturally different. So when we talk about Africa, it's also important to warn ourselves that we are talking about a continent that is, in fact, the most diverse, the most heterogeneous of all continents in the world.
I once encountered an elderly German woman who spoke very dismissively about Africa as a whole, and she said Africans are backward because the fruits practically grow into their mouths. They are too lazy to strive for innovation while we work hard for our success. That statement made me angry, and I didn't know where to start in responding to such ignorance. Where would you start?
In my younger days, I would be angry at such a statement, but I am not angry. It makes me introspect, because let us look at the evidence. The argument that we were enslaved, the argument that we were colonized and therefore we cannot achieve certain things is, in my view, without merit. We have, since the independence of African countries, Egypt regained her independence in 1922, South Sudan, before it split in 1956, Ghana in 1957, Ethiopia was not effectively colonized, Liberia, which was for freed slaves from the United States of America in the 19th century. We have had sufficient time to do things which could catapult us into the arena of innovation. So when people make such remarks, there is merit in them because we have continued to allow ourselves as individual countries to be manipulated so that our resources are taken away. We have remained exporters of primary products. Look at cocoa, for example. We produce cocoa in La Côte d'Ivoire, in Togo, in Ghana, and then where do we export it? We export it to Switzerland, which has not a single bush of cocoa, and then we import chocolates. Look at cotton. We do the same. We export our cotton to different parts of the world, to the Netherlands, then we import the clothing. Look at the minerals. There is not a single African country that produces a mobile phone. The best we do is to assemble. Yet coltan and rare earth is found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Look at uranium. There is not a single African country, aside from South Africa, one may say, and Egypt a little, that is using nuclear technology for the benefit of the continent. So when people are blaming us that the weather is too kind on us, and that has lulled us into a false sense of security, it should be a wake-up call. And permit me to tell you and to give you countries which were our age mates in terms of regaining independence, which have since catapulted themselves into the orbit of innovation and invention. Look at Korea, South Korea, and what they have done after the Korean War. They are into mobile telephony, they are into artificial intelligence, they are into the drone technology. Look at Vietnam, which was at war when I was myself a young high school student. Vietnam now has a GDP which is bigger than the GDP of one of our largest countries, Nigeria, or even South Africa. So my own view is,
But the first countries that you just named, they did it with the blessing of the West, of the US. So is it not a condition to develop like that?
it is not blessing. It is about using your status to engage constructively. And I want to give you this example. Has it ever surprised you that some of our politicians are the richest individuals, that they lead the poorest countries and yet they are multi-billionaires? Look at somebody like Mobutu Sese Seko in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who ran a kleptocracy and was financing French politicians, was building in his rural home palaces. Suppose he had used the wealth that he had to build industries, to build the Grand Inga Dam. So you don't need the blessing of anybody. You can move regardless if you want to. And I'll give you countries that have done that in the continent of Africa. Look at little Mauritius. No resources at all. What has it done? Despite attempts at undermining her, just using what she has. Tourism has been a major factor. Look at little Rwanda in the recent past since 1994. In other words, if you engage constructively, you will achieve certain things. But if you want to engage in lamentation and waiting for Godot to guide you on what to do, then you'll never realize your potential. Look at Nigeria. What does Nigeria have that stands in the way of our development? Is just good leadership. And Chinua Achebe wrote about it in 1983 when he said the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a problem of leadership. And permit me, look at Qatar. Little country. What does it have? Oil and gas. What does Nigeria have? Oil and gas. Angola, oil and gas. Equatorial Guinea, oil and gas. Ghana, oil and gas. So those arguments are no longer available to us What we must do is to make demands of our leaders. Unfortunately, most African countries are run by kleptocrats, and the few that are moving in the right direction are demonstrating that it can be done.
Would you not say that the Western system, they need corruption and those kleptocrats, and they need debt? They need the IMF to put sanctions and more loans and higher interest rates and all this stuff to keep Africa like it is?
You've got it right. The Western economic model demands and requires that Africa be kept in a perpetual state of indebtedness and confusion. And when that has happened, it becomes very easy to manipulate. But we know that. Knowing that as we do, it is our duty to now do things that are going to ensure that we are no longer manipulated. And let me give you an example. In the East African community, we used to have an East African community in the 1960s where we had East African Airways, East African Railways and Harbors, East African Post and Telecommunication. And we were ahead in terms of integration, ahead of the European Union. We had a single currency, single education system. Then we broke it and recreated it. And in the recent past, we said that we are going to eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers and to allow goods to move freely across the region. But what do the West do, the European Union and the Americans? When we had agreed, for example, that we were no longer going to import second-hand clothing in order to rebuild our textile industry, they came to Kenya, my country, and persuaded the political class to enter into an arrangement with them, and that undermined us. So there are times when we, through our political leaders, are the ones who undermine the things that we ought to do right. And once again, the world is about cutthroat competition. There will always be those who want to interfere. Look at China. When I was growing up in the recent past, China was a backwater country that we did not think much about. And despite the hurdles, and in spite of the hurdles that stood in our way, today you cannot ignore China. You cannot ignore Indonesia, because you cannot ignore India. Because despite attempts by Western institutions such as the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and World Bank, which were never created for Africa. They were created in 1944 for the purpose of rebuilding Europe after the World War II. We are simply grafted into it. But yet again, somehow we forget. Right now, if you look at the African Development Bank, which was created by African countries, the second highest shareholder is the United States of America. The Japanese are there. The Germans are there. The European Union are there. So we in the African continent must just wake up and, as the Americans would say, smell the coffee. Because if we don't, we'll continue to be manipulated and we will continue to be dominated.
Let's assume you are the leader of an African country and your country is in deep crisis. And if you don't turn to Washington, IMF, World Bank, what would be your alternative?
My alternative, number one, we've got to organize our internal politics in a manner that puts every person's hands on deck. Cut our coat according to our cloth. And this has been done. I have seen this in a number of countries in the recent past, but it was not sustained. Look at little Eritrea, which does not owe any country any money. People may say that they are suffering. Of course, there'll be pain and suffering in the early days, but ultimately you begin to grow on your own terms. There are mistakes that may be made, that are being made in Eritrea, but on certain fundamentals, they have liberated themselves from the slavery of the IMF and World Bank. Look at what is happening in the Sahel. They may say that they gained power through unconstitutional means. I prefer to say extraordinary means. In Burkina Faso, in Niger, and in Mali, they have now come through a federation. They are renegotiating the contract that they entered into with the French companies in uranium. They are sending away French troops. Are they suffering? Yes, they are. There are certain things that are happening. They don't have as much electricity as they would want, but they are beginning to move in the right direction. And in Burkina Faso in the 1980s, Thomas Sankara did exactly that. The question is sustainability. So if I were a leader, I would be very clear. Domestic tax would be something that I would ensure is used effectively. Reduction of expenditure on military. Ensure that we feed ourselves agriculture. Ensure that we use our resources in the area of health and medicine, and identify, friend, the reality and the beauty of the world is that you cannot be completely shut out. Somehow, there'll always be countries and individuals that want to work with you. And I've seen this in Somaliland, which is not recognized by any country. I've been to Hargeisa many times. They are running a functioning government that holds elections and things are going on. Employment is created. Many African countries are sending their people to work there. It can be done, but it must be done on the basis of selflessness so that the leadership leads by example and the population will know that this is sacrificial leadership which we ought to support.
So it's about visionary leadership, not a short-sighted view.
Vision is the most important thing. And when you are talking about visionary leadership, the dividends may not be immediate. If you look at this continent, in countries where we have had visionary leadership, Tanzania is one of them. You know, when Tanganyika regained her independence and ultimately in 1964 merged with Zanzibar to create what we now know as Tanzania, and President Nyerere and his administration attempted to talk about what he called villagization, ujamaa, people wrote its obituary as a failed economic attempt. But the Tanzania that we see today, which is steadily beginning to overtake her neighbors, is because of that foundation. With over 100 plus ethnic groups, they are welded together and they think of a nation. That was a visionary leader who after 25 years in 1985 said, at 63, I am now retiring. And you can see the politics is moving in the right direction. Of course, it cannot always be perfect. That is the kind of visionary leadership that I'm talking about. And we have seen it in this continent. And I believe that it is something that can be done. And I must mention Sam Nujoma, who passed away only last week of Namibia. Namibia still has many historical problems, particularly with the land question. But you can see that because he laid a firm foundation stone, you've seen succession, and the subsequent leaders can now begin to address the historical questions. Vision is what is critical in leadership.
In Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, I spoke with many people from the streets and from the media, academia about African leadership. And the majority mentioned only a few figures who gave them hope. Nyerere, Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi, Idi Amin, Magufuli. That were the names that I heard. What do these figures have in common?
I do not know whether Idi Amin, in my view, would fall in that category. But there is wisdom in acknowledging a few leaders who have, during their time, tried to do well. I think Nyerere belongs in that pantheon of leaders. I think Patrice Emery Lumumba, just for the promise, he did not serve long enough. He was eliminated too quickly. He belonged to that pantheon. I believe that Kwame Nkrumah, who was eliminated in 1966, cannot be ignored. I believe that Samora Moises Machel cannot be ignored. I believe that Modibo Keita cannot be ignored. I believe that Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau cannot be ignored. Kenneth Kaunda must not be ignored. So Muammar al-Gaddafi cannot be ignored because he was the man who in recent times was pushing the reorganization of African Union or OAU into African Union. But Idi Amin, I think I would not include him in that space at all. He may have had moments of saying useful things, but he cannot, with the same mouth, say Idi Amin and say Julius Kambarage.
Can you name current leaders that give you hope?
Magufuli, of course, must be remembered. I'm struggling when you say current leaders. I'm struggling very much, but I believe that Paul Kagame has demonstrated useful leadership after the genocide, and what he must now work on is a succession plan to ensure that there is sustainability of his ideas. Yoweri Kaguta Museveni also should be working on succession planning. If they were to ensure that succession planning is done in a proper manner, then their sins may be forgiven them. But after that, one almost struggles.
What about Burkina Faso or Niger?
Right now, there is a new crop of individuals who have come. The jury, as one would say, is still out, but that group of individuals that have emerged in Burkina Faso, Traore, Assimi Goïta in Mali, and in Niger, if they were to midwife a process of return to civilian government, then that is a good meeting. But it is too early to say whether they have failed or succeeded. But in these early days, some useful decisions are being made, but too early to say that they are either successful or they have failed. But remember also that the road to success is always under construction.
That's true. Do you think it is a problem that those leaders that you just named, they are seeking protection from Russia and China in the long term?
You know, what is happening now in Africa, particularly in those troubled areas, is suspicion of the erstwhile colonizers. That is France, Belgium, the United Kingdom, Portugal. Their new entrants in the arena, namely the Russians, who are not traditionally colonizers. And when you see many African countries pandering towards Russia, they are nostalgic about the former Soviet Union, because the former Soviet Union did support many freedom-fighting movements in the continent of Africa. China also supported many freedom-fighting movements. And to the extent that these countries are weak when they expelled the French or when they expel any other power, they go to the next strong power. And this happens to be Russia and sometimes China. But I keep on warning African countries that even Russia has our own interests, that even China has our own interests, and that it is important in these very early stages to define the relationship that we have with the both of them so that they don't end up being in the same space or occupying the space that was occupied by the former colonizers. The definition of relationship. If they are offering you military support, you must ask them, you have come in the year 2025, when are you leaving? In other words, the entry must also give us the exit plan. Otherwise, they'll become permanent fixtures.
I'm religious. I would say I'm spiritual, and I was observing in the last years the role of religion on this continent. And I think there are forms, rather deformations of religion that have been made compatible with neo-colonial power structures. And sometimes they are sedating the people, offering them prosperity and the prosperity gospel preachers. And then it is a business. It's a $1 billion industry. And at the same time, there are visionary leaders that were deeply inspired by religion, Christianity, Islam. If I think of Malcolm X, where do you see the difference between those different forms of religion?
Religion, aside from spirituality, has always been used and or misused for different purposes. In fact, I remember as a young history student, we used to be taught is the flag followed the cross. And if you look at each one of the countries and the role of religion, whether the Roman Catholic Church or the Church of England, some